Hello. This is going to be a really brief introduction to some ideas around collective behavior, and especially like how they relate to social networks and communication networks. So let's jump into it. So the one of the key questions here is how groups make good decisions, and hopefully you realized by this point in the class that like just assuming that something scales up is not always a good assumption. That groups are not just collections of individuals. There's interdependence and lots of kind of multiplex relationships that influence how groups do things. And so different network structures, group processes can lead to very different outcomes and different decisions that might be made. So some key concepts or ideas here around collective intelligence, shared understanding, and decision-making processes. So when we talk about collective intelligence, people use this term in different ways. One way is something like the wisdom of crowds. There is a famous example of estimating the weight of an ox or a cow. I don't remember. This is Galton in the, I don't know, like 100 years ago. Took a bunch of people at a fair that were trying to estimate the weight of this cow, and realized that taking the average of people's guesses actually gave a very accurate guess. And in many contexts, collecting diverse independent opinions can lead to good decisions. And so, as basically the basic idea is that that some people get things wrong in one way, and some people get things wrong in another direction, and that those sort of, in many cases, can cancel each other out. And we get something close to the truth. There are different processes for aggregating people's beliefs. This can happen through markets or just literally taking an average, and that often, right, as mentioned, taking even a simple average can outperform even experts. Can do really well. So that's sort of one version of collective intelligence. When we look at this sort of wisdom of crowds and communication networks, there is the original formulation was that people had to be independent, right? Because if you gained information from other people, it's really easy to get into groupthink, that you'll kind of err in one direction or the other. And the key idea of wisdom of crowds is that you want these errors to be, normally distributed and cancel each other out. However, Damon Centola, Josh Becker, and a few folks in that area have shown that decentralized networks can actually improve estimates. That people who, the kind of intuition behind this is that people who were really wrong on either side of the distribution are more likely to move toward the middle than people who were right. So if you were correct, then you sort of are often more confident in your beliefs and you're less likely to move. And so with decentralized networks where you learn about other people's beliefs or guesses, you move toward them, and you move more the more wrong you are. So the idea, however, there is a risk of groupthink, and so the structure of networks and the decisions can matter. And so centralized networks can lead to conformity. This is an example of groupthink, or yes men or something where if one person's influence is outsized and they are wrong, then it leads the whole group astray. So that's the big idea there. When we think about another version, I guess, of group decision-making processes is like building shared understanding. This is really important, both for understanding. So these like collective intelligence and especially wisdom of crowds are often about like numerical estimation, right? Estimating how many jelly beans are in a jar, or the weight of an ox. Things where there's like a clear kind of single valued answer. But in many group contexts, there's a lot more that has to happen than just coming to the right answer about one thing. That we sort of really want to build. We want to understand what we are doing as a group, right? Mako Hill has some great research about like Wikipedia working because, in part, it was understandable as an encyclopedia, that there were other attempts at around the same time which were and less like encyclopedias, and so it's harder for a group to kind of navigate and understand and build a shared understanding of what the goal of the group was, and that Wikipedia succeeded in part because it built on this shared cultural understanding, and so that can be really important, especially for distributed groups that are like online groups where it's there's less ability to sort of navigate some of these things. So one way of thinking about this is as shared mental models. This is common knowledge about what the group is, what roles people have, what the tasks are. These can really facilitate coordination and cooperation, and these have to be developed, right? This takes additional overhead to build shared mental models and make them work. We bring this back to network concepts. Homophily, similarity can help, right? That homophily can lead to like a shared culture, a shared understanding, but can also lead to groupthink, right? That it doesn't enable us to see additional perspectives or to see outside of sort of the bubble of shared experiences that we have. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword that diversity can be harder. It can be less comfortable. There's some good research about this, but it can also allow us to see new perspectives and to not be led in wrong directions because we don't see different ways of approaching a problem, different problems that might occur, etc. Because we've all had the same experiences. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of group processes that there are different. If we think about building a shared understanding, but also like how does a group get things done? How does a group build that shared understanding? Whose voices get heard, etc. This is Anita Woolley and co-authors have done a bunch of work about sort of putting people together in groups. What kinds of group succeeds in doing what kinds of different tasks? And so they give them a bunch of different tasks, different kinds of groups, and they've identified. If you think of like IQ for individual, the C factor for collective intelligence, and groups have collective intelligence, a collective ability to meet goals that is different from and above and beyond what the individuals have, and only partially and not very well predicted by, for example, the intelligence of the people in the group. And a lot of this comes from social sensitivity of the members, equal participation, and the other thing they found is the number of women in the group, that a higher number of women leads to greater collective intelligence. There are as well, if we think about decision-making processes, above and beyond the sort of kind of broad, equal participation, that there are processes like voting and consensus, single leader decision, which, each of these can be more effective depending on the task at hand, the group, etc. Unfortunately, it's and I'm not an expert in this, so maybe I'm kind of compressing this area down incorrectly. But as I understand it, like these each have a role, and it's not as straightforward as we might hope to say, you are this kind of group doing this kind of task, and therefore you should use this. But that in some cases it can be helpful to have each of these types of processes. Okay, so what are some threats to having good group decisions? Again, this is a very brief overview of some of these things. So one we've talked about already is groupthink, that both because, so this is sort of related to the spiral of silence, that either proactively or subconsciously we'll talk about two different ways, right? So there's one which is sort of this spiral of silence, which is that we think that our perspective is in the minority and won't be appreciated, and so we suppress it, right? That we might care more about the harmony of the group than reaching the right answer, or there might be a boss or a manager who has power and who has a bad idea, but we don't want to correct them for career or social reasons. We get to groupthink. The second version is, we talked about a little bit before, that if there's like too much homophily in a group, then maybe there just aren't people who have alternate opinions, and so so we have groupthink because we all are too similar to each other. Another version is of threat is social loafing, that people have. This is, for example, a group project in school that you might work less hard because you hope that others will pick up the slack and that you will, you still get the same grade no matter how much work you put in, and so you're incentivized to put in less work. This is sort of a collective action problem is another word for that. And so that's one problem that's very common in lots of different contexts. Another kind of depending on this is not as common a problem, but can be a problem in group decision making is polarization. There's some evidence that that group discussions can lead to extreme positions. That when, for example, in the radicalization literature. In radicalizing communities, sometimes a group can become radicalized because having a more radical position on the topic is seen as sort of morally or socially beneficial, and so the whole group sort of talks itself into becoming more and more radical. And then finally, and related to this, conformity. This is similar to groupthink, but that there's sort of pressure to conform, pressure to go along with the group. And that can suppress this ability to bring in outside information. I mean, this is kind of taken together. I would say one of the important lessons from research on groups is the need to build processes and recruitment and attitudes and culture that encourage dissenting opinions, or different opinions, that encourage diversity of thought, that along a lot of dimensions it's really easy for there to be a lack of novel information, a lack of novel ideas, and novel perspectives, and that can lead to worse decisions. So there's your very brief overview. Looking forward to talking more about this.